All right, here we are recapping week number 8 here on Friday Night Drive here on Shaw Local. My name is Matt Rodewald. Steve Soucie with me as always as we talk about how week 8 went down, and it is amazing. And we say this all the time. It is hard to believe that we're at this week of the season, but we're at the end for a lot of teams, and it's amazing that this thing flies by so fast. Week 9 coming up, and 8 weeks in the books. What do you think at this point? What are your overwhelming thoughts? As we get to
Yeah,
week number 9.
it has just it is flown by. I think that's one of those things that I think you could actually probably study. How do these 2 months go by so quickly? I mean, it feels like it just zips right on through. But here we are on the cusp of it, and it's been to this point. It has been a very fascinating regular season. There have been a lot of things that have not materialized in the way that maybe I expected them to, and it shows in the numbers. I mean, I think we've had a lot of games this year where you genuinely mean it when you say, hey, that looks like a coin flip on paper. And then more often than not, it turns into a coin flip on the field. So that makes for a lot of exciting games and a lot of things to break down. And it makes for a really chaotic playoff picture as we head into things, because you're going to have a lot of teams in that bracket, like we've talked about before. 2 losses, 3 losses, maybe even 4, that you can genuinely say are a dangerous team that might find themselves at Hancock Stadium.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, too. I mean, we'll have plenty of time here to talk about the brackets or what they're looking like or who could get a home game, who could not here. And we're going to be speculating both tonight and really all week long here. But, I just kind of want to put in perspective for some of it, too. We talk so much about playoff teams and about, the teams that could win a state championship. But we also know that there are 500 teams playing football across the state of Illinois. Half of them, if at least, are going to be done this week. And that's a lot of seniors whose seasons and careers suddenly come to an end here. So I just want to acknowledge that, because it's important to understand that as one who played on a 1-8 and 2-7 team, there are a lot of kids out there right now that are watching this, a lot of parents that kind of support this program there, that have had kids playing football for 8, 9, 10 years, as a youth all the way up to the high school level. And it's jarring to see it. I'm sure you've seen it covering senior nights, but it's jarring to see when that season ends that it's like it hits you like a ton of bricks, like, wow, it's over, because you're so focused on what the next week is like. Are there any memories to that you've seen, just places you've been where you've seen those things happen, where you can catch the emotion? You're like, wow, this catches me off guard too, even as an adult.
I think one of the things that always kind of impresses me about those types of situations is how often I'll run into a team that, the parlance is, oh, they're not playing for anything. But in reality, some of those kids have that recognition and are like, maybe I'll never get to do this again. And they go out and they play so hard in games that are, essentially, in the parlance of everything else, meaningless, because it doesn't mean anything towards the playoffs. And that's something that always impresses me about this sport in general, and the kind of energy that it ingrains in kids and student athletes, but also in programs, the programs that instill a kind of culture that say, hey, you finish what you started. It doesn't matter if this means we're 3-6 or we're preparing for a first round playoff game. Finish what you start. And a lot of times that turns into some inspiring things. And I think that's why we get so many chaotic results in week 9, because you have programs out there that are just willing to cut it all loose and say, hey, let's just leave it all out there. See what happens. Maybe we're not supposed to beat these guys who are 5-3 coming in or whatever. Mm-hmm. Let's leave it all out there. And I think that's always a really fascinating thing about week 9. You're right. There are 200 plus teams that are packing up the equipment after Friday or Saturday afternoon. But a lot of those like to leave something to remember them by, and that's always a fascinating thing to see.
I mean, my senior year, my last week, we had to go to Riverside Brookfield from Geneva. That's week 9, and we were 1-7. And if you remember those RB teams of the late 90s, they were 5 receivers. It was the Zeman crew, and they're flying all over the field. And that team was 8-0 that we faced. And oddly enough, they got beat in the first round of the playoffs. But we thought, hey, we're going to go shock the world. This is a 10th ranked team in the AP poll. This is a big deal for us. I mean, look, I was a skinny kid. I'm not anymore. 135, 145, and typically a safety. But back in the 90s, you're like, well, I guess we're going to have to play nickel. So I started my final game at outside linebacker. It made no sense. Never did before. Never would have done since. But those are the little stories. Just that narrative right there, just that little anecdote. Someone's going to have that story to tell, over the campfire or, at the beach and with their kids or with their buddies in college, coming from some random parts around, the Chicagoland area. And I think that's the kind of the vibrance and the fabric of football that we need to kind of remember, that why we cover this sport, why we're involved in this is because of the ambiance of fall. I would tell you this, Souce, this has been one of the most pleasant weather seasons we've ever had. And it started late because this could have been a nightmare. But what are we going to have on Friday? We're going to have another 70-degree day. And there could be maybe one game where you had to wear long sleeves if you're a player, especially one of those sitting on the bench going, well, I'm not going to play. I might as well wear long sleeves so I don't get cold out there. But yeah, this is one of those things where it's kind of, there's a beauty behind all of it, just the scenery, the ambiance, but also the fabric of the football community, that even though there are teams that are getting eliminated this week, and there are those 2-6 teams that are going to jump up and bite somebody and just go out on that good note and remember that win for a long, long time. That's the fun part of it for me.
Well, we're not blowing smoke either when we talk about this, because there were 9 last year that did that to a team that was sitting on the playoff fence. They needed the win to get in. There were 9 different teams that had essentially, like I said, nothing to play for, and just embraced that spoiler role and just wreaked havoc on that playoff field in week 9 last year. So it's always interesting to see the programs that do that manage to just put it out there and say, hey, all we got to do tonight is play spoiler. So we're gonna go wreck those guys' playoff dreams. We don't have any, so we're gonna go take care of theirs too. So that's always a fun little dynamic that comes into play.
And to tie a bow on this, if you're 2-6 and you win that game, I'm paying attention to who that coach is, because that's a culture that said they were able to get the seniors who had nothing to play for and rally them to go play their best football game to finish the season, knowing they weren't going to play next week. They could have packed it in. So that makes a big difference to me, and I pay attention to that. All right, so let's flip the script from the teams under 500 to the teams over 500. And there aren't very many teams with zeros on the right side of the column, as we usually see. What are we down to, 27 undefeated teams at this point?
There are 27, and I did a little bit of digging on this today because I was kind of curious about it. I already knew that it's never been lower than this, ever. We've never had this few undefeated teams heading into week 8. We've never had this few undefeated teams after week 9. So it's an unprecedented type of situation that we're talking about. Like, for context, there were 28 that made the playoffs last year at the end of the season at 9-0. We are 27 now. We're guaranteed to be at 25 because we've got 2 8-0 matchups this week. Then on top of that, 14 of those teams are playing someone this week that has at least 6 wins in week 9. So there's a very likely situation that not only will it drop to 25, it's going to drop lower than 25 because of that kind of scenario where there's a lot of 8-0s that are playing quality 7-1s, quality 6-2s, and if they don't keep their eye on the ball, they'll be in that 1-loss column too. So that's a really fascinating type of situation to look at as we move forward.
Is there somebody that's 8-0 that you thought, how in the heck are they 8-0? I mean, if you look through this stuff to look in detail, I mean, there's a lot. There's the Lincoln Way East we expect to be there. Even Geneva's a bit of a surprise, but it's one win that I expected them not to get, to get to 8-0 so easily at 7-1. Is there that one team that jumps out at you as, wow, they've run the table so far?
There are a couple that kind of surprised me. I think the one that really jumps off the page, and I've mentioned them several times because I think it's remarkable, only East Richland could go from 0-9 to 9-0. That's the one that really pops off the group for me in terms of, hey, what's going on there? There are a couple of other ones that, like, I wouldn't have bet on that horse, even though I think they're a pretty good team. Lions would be one that I think them finishing 9-0, and that's more of a nod to the conference that they're playing in. that if you would have told me that they were going to run the gauntlet out of all of those teams, I probably wouldn't have guessed that. That's definitely one of them that I would have been not so sure about that. And from there's a couple of other ones that maybe are a little bit surprising, but there's a lot of usual suspects on that list too.
Yeah, I would say on that category, Sycamore is one where it's like, well, someone's going to get them, and then they never do. Every year, I mean, Morse, I expected them to not do what they did last week, and I expected Canelan to have a better game against them. But, kudos to Sycamore. They continue to keep churning out wins, and they find their way to 8-9 wins in the regular season each and every year. So kudos to them for sure, and the Spartans expecting a deep run in the playoffs. Where are we with the Catholic League in terms of sorting that out? I know there's a lot of talk about, obviously, Mount Carmel and Loyola coming up here, but is there something that jumped off the page this past week that really stood out? We'll get to the crazy finishes and the overtime games. We have plenty of those. But is there one that kind of jumped out to you and says, you know what, that might be the team that's going to do some serious damage in the postseason?
Well, it was confirmed this week, but I'll tell you one team, if I'm somebody drawing up those playoff brackets, that I do not want to see on the other line from me right now, and that's Brother Rice. I want nothing to do with them right now as an opponent because – they have caught fire here. That Mount Carmel game was obviously a big win for them. But since then, they have laid the hammer on a couple of pretty good football teams after that Mount Carmel win, strung together 4 straight victories. There was a time not so long ago, we're looking at Brother Rice at 1-3 in their remaining schedule and thinking, I wonder if they can get in as a 4-win team. I mean, that was what we were looking at. But now that looks like an entirely different football team. A lot more like the team that I can say now that although they haven't climbed that high in the poll before, I ranked them 9th to start the season and felt like I grotesquely overrated them. I'm starting to feel like maybe they might get back there for me. I mean, that's what we're going through for. So, but that's the one team I think out of the Catholic League right now that I'm looking at and saying, hey, don't want to deal with them. Another one that it's funny to say this because they're 7-1. But I still don't think anybody is talking about Marist.
Yeah,
all they keep doing is winning. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. So I think they're a potentially really dangerous team because, Mike Fitzgerald is already in 1 year has already got that program up to the point where it's like, I think they're kind of a threat here, guys. You better watch out for them. So that's pretty impressive just in the fact that, they were a good program and they have been a good program for lots of years.
For a long time, yeah.
To make that coaching transition and then just kind of all immediately just kind of escalate them up into that discussion where you have to include them on a short list of teams that you think might have a shot at making that run to Hancock in 8A.
That's the one thing with that. That's the one team where I'm like, I want to see where that bracket falls for them because it depends on where Lincoln Way East is on the other side. I think that's really the key for them. Lincoln Way East, I think, could find their way there no matter who's on the other side. But, with Marist, I just want to see if they have the friendly bracket to get there. Not that they need a friendly bracket, but I just wondered how that path is going to go for Marist. And, really, with all the Catholic League teams. And the other team for me that's just kind of scary in terms of the fact that we're not talking about them eking into the postseason is Nazareth. With Nazareth being 7-1 here at this point, solidly in the field, it has to be a very different feeling in LaGrange Park at this point compared to where they've been in years past. And maybe that's, I don't know if that's good or bad at this point.
Yeah, it's very confusing when you've gone through the playoff projecting like I have for a while here to see Nazareth where they are with their seed line. Because I'm used to waiting and hearing the belly aching when the bracket comes out and Nazareth is a 13 seed or a 14 seed. And everybody's like, oh, they're not a 13 or a 14. What is this? This is a stupid system, blah, 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 blah. Well, now they're going to be the seed where they belong. I mean, they're probably going to end up as a 1. I mean, that's the reality of the situation. So that argument goes out the window at least a little bit. And the bracket looks a little bit more, I guess, formed like you think it should be formed in 5A North. So that's another fun thing about this, that is with them locking it in and piling up the wins, they're going to be closer to the seed that they actually belong at. So that's interesting. I'll throw another team into this discussion too while we're at it, just kind of crossing my mind. Montini is another team that I think is, based on where they're going to be in that 3A playoff field. And They gave Byron all they wanted last year in the semifinals. And now I think that team, with one more year under its belt, it was a very young team last year, is showing what it is capable of. And that looks like a 3A team that no one has a schedule that has prepared them better for the playoffs than Montini's has. And they're sitting there at 6-2 now, possibility of going 7-2 if they can beat St. Lawrence in week 9. A seed in the neighborhood of, probably 4-6 if they can get that win. And they're another team that in the past you've looked at that bracket and said, Montini's a 14. Come on, guys. Or if they can even get in. I mean, that's been an issue in the past if they couldn't even get to 5. So having them locked in, they are a dangerous, dangerous team to have to deal with in 3A North.
You look at them, you look at DePaul Prep, you look at even IC Catholic to some extent. And then outside of the Catholic League, because it's so parallel, but Wheaton Academy, one of those teams too in the past where it's like, well, you never know, but now their seed lines all make sense, this year. And so that's going to be fascinating. And that St. Lawrence game that you mentioned, very interesting swing game in different classes. Talking about 4A and 3A. Be keeping an eye on that one for sure. You go from the Chicago Catholic League to the Chicago Public League. Have you sorted everything out as best you can to get into week 9? Are you thankful that they don't have the first round of the Public League playoffs week 9 anymore?
Well, I mean, they still trickered me. They did a little bit of trickery this week. There were some teams that did not have a week 9 game scheduled until basically this weekend. So sorting all that out was a little bit complicated, but the answer to that question is no, because there are some squirrely things happening in the bottom of that league. There's a fun week 9 game in the Public League between Morgan Park and Simeon, but there are other ones that have these like weird little undercurrents. Lane, for example, sits there at 3-5, and you're like, why are you talking about Lane? And the weird thing about Lane is Lane has an absolute truckload of playoff points. So if they can get that win, we need 4-win teams. Believe it or not,
Yep.
One of the leading contenders, possibly the top contender to get in as a 4-win team, might be Lane, a Chicago Public League team. They are going to be over 50 points. How far over 50 points is how the rest of the Public League sorts out this week. But they could end up with 53, 54 points, and that would probably put them at the front of the line of teams hoping to get in as a 4-win team. So there's all these little interior stories in the Public League, and I don't know that much about these teams at this point in time to really kind of decipher whether or not is this team better than this team better than this team. And there are some straight games in week 9 that literally are for a playoff spot. I won't go into the great details of it, but it's basically a play-in game. You got to win this game to finish second place in one of these divisions, and that's the only way that you can get to the playoffs. So those are drawn out this way. There are 2 bids on the line this weekend in that fashion. And the other really curious thing about things statewide, how everyone who's talking about this is, oh, look at those 4-4 games. Look at those 4, the 4-4 teams playing one another. Look at that. You got any idea how many games statewide this week there are between a 4-4 team and a 4-4 team, Matt?
Not very many, I would imagine. Am I wrong?
The correct answer is 0.
Okay.
So
how often does that happen?
It is. I'm sure it's never happened. I was talking to somebody about this today. I'm like, I'm really good at simple math. I'd like to talk to a mathematician and know what the odds are of there being 500 plus teams in this scheduling format and absolutely no 4-4 against 4-4 pairings coming to fruition. I got to believe the odds are astronomically against it.
Yeah, you're probably right that it's first time. I'm looking at the playoff points for those 3 and 5 teams. Lane, Kenwood, both with 47 right now, both at 3 and 5. There's Phillips there, 3 and 5 with 44 points. Dunbar probably not going to get there for sure, but you can look at that and you see what you mean there. And St. Ignatius sitting there at 48 points at 3 and 5 in the Catholic League. So all eyes are going to be on the city and those teams to see if they can back their way into 4 and 5 for sure. And some of those 4-4 teams with tough matchups that dropped to 4 and 5 for sure. But I enjoyed last year seeing the 3 and 5s kind of sneak in the back door to see if they can get into the postseason for sure. You're listening to the Friday Night Drive podcast, Week 8 recap. Matt Rodewald, Steve Soucie with you here as we go through the games from last week, too. I know we're kind of looking forward a little bit. We're kind of cheating with the brackets, too, and seeing these points. We can't help it, but week 9 is to want to move ahead. But which was your favorite overtime crazy bonkers finish from last week?
I think it was Lincoln Way West Lockport, but
Really?
you could make an argument for a whole bunch of them. I also found it humorous as well that late I found a feed for that Homewood Flossmoor Naperville North game.
You did?
I did. I found the feed actually after the game was over, but forgot that I had found it. Clicked on it, and it was probably like halfway through the game, and it went so long that I had finished all that I needed to do on Friday night, and it was still up on the side screen over here. So that's how long that game took. So interesting game. Jacob Bell, obviously ridiculous in that game for Naperville North, finished with 9 combined touchdowns. Can't imagine that's happened too many times before.
Yeah.
So that was pretty remarkable. And but there were so many of those that just kind of came down to the wire. A lot of them had like heavy playoff weight implications on them in terms of who won it, who lost it. And so that made for some real interesting score chasing. And we did some of it on Friday night, but it seemed like every 5 or 10 minutes we were discovering another game that was in the
this was in overtime?
Down the wire, and it was just, it was crazy.
You combine senior night starting late and then a bunch of overtime, and it's like, well, it's 11:30. They're still going. Mine was Grant, the Bulldogs winning at Antioch, because I'm going to give the Grant Athletics Twitter a hard time. You got to keep tweeting. I know it's exciting. I get it. I understand it. As a school admin, I'm with you. I get it. You got to keep tweeting. Don't stop the tweeting. People are following it. They are on bended knee trying to find out the result of the Bulldogs. But, I kid. That was a great win for the Bulldogs, and that changed the 6A bracket for sure.
Yep.
How much did that impact it to you?
Yeah, it moves some things around. I mean, we've talked a lot about 6A, 5A, and the way that these moves are happening, where you have these games where it looks like you've got a pretty clear favorite, but you still have 2 playoff teams in the mix. So the win-loss is not going to move just one team in that situation. It's going to move both. So, and then you might have a situation where they're tied, and then you've got a head-to-head thing, and it's all kinds of there's just a lot of permutations when you have, just for example, you have, maybe a 5-2 team against a 6-1 or something, where you think the favoritism is pretty clear. The seed stack looks like it's not going to be moving around too much, but then that 5-2 jumps up and bites them. And then all of a sudden you still got 2 playoff teams. You're not moving anyone in or out. You're just moving that seed line, and you're just jostling them around. And before you know it, you got a team that was on the 11 or 12 line a week before. They're up on the 6 now. And then that moves, the guy that used to be on the 6 down towards the middle. Your 8-9 game flips. It's just like, so all of a sudden a whole bunch of teams have just moved in different directions.
This is the kind of domino effect we talk about with these games. And that's why we point to those early season non-conference games, because there's a week 1 game that you're like, I didn't see it coming that way. Well, remember that come week 9, because that's where these things kind of waterfall all the way down the dial in terms of the playoff points and everything else. For me, one of the most exciting games wasn't an overtime game. It was in the Big Northern Conference. It was the Byron-Dixon game that lived up to the hype. What did we learn from the way that thing turned out? For me, there's a couple of different things, but I'll start with you.
I think the most interesting thing about that game was it really, I don't think I was doubting it that much, but it really, really confirmed to me how good of a football team Dixon really is. Mm-hmm. Like, even though they didn't get the win, it's one of those things where you look at it and go, man, that's a tough loss for them. If they can shake that off, it should boost their confidence. That doesn't happen very often, but there was a lot of people out there that were saying, nah, that's not going to be a close game. I mean, it's still Byron, guys. Like, you're better, but you're not that much better. Like, you haven't closed the gap. Well, they've closed the gap. I mean, it really, that's really what they have now closed the gap. So, and for them to have that, I mean, even though it was a loss, you get through this week. I mean, it's a game that they very well should win. You get through that win, you go into the playoffs at 8-1. You're going to probably end up with like a 3 seed. and hopefully for them in a good spot in the bracket. Not to spoil too many things, but in my current projection,
right? Yeah,
their first game is a dooze. I'll put it that way. If it holds,
it sure is. I saw it.
But it's it basically, if that holds, then maybe not. Maybe you're not that excited about getting that 3 seed line, but it's still you'd rather be a 3 than a 6 or whatever. So that makes it fun. But for me, I think the biggest confirmation there was Dixon is legitimate, and I don't want to say I thought they were bad or anything.
No,
I just wasn't completely sold that maybe they were as good as the numbers were saying that they were. I'm a believer now.
It's amazing how you can be sold on a team when they lose a football game, and Dixon's the perfect reason that you don't want to look at just the score and go, see, 29-28. Byron had to make a gutsy call to go for 2 to get the win. And if they don't get that conversion, then we're talking about this conversation very differently right now. Byron's a good football team. We knew they would be. We knew they'd get tested a little bit. But I would tell you what, for Dixon to put 28 points on that defense tells you that Dixon offense is really good. It's not to take away Byron's defense. It's to say, Dixon's they're a bit of a wagon offensively at this point, and that's kind of a good thing for them. They should have that confidence going into the postseason. And what's odd too is the fact that Byron's in 3A, Dixon's a 4A school, and when you're using the 3A loss to build confidence, that just shows you the respect and the the success that Byron's had over the last few years. You could go 20, 30 years really if you want to, but just to show that they were able to meet the moment at that point. Dixon's going to be something to worry about for a lot of teams in 4A. They're a challenger for the state title as far as I'm concerned in 4A. If they can get that path, that's right, so they can get a rhythm going in the postseason for sure.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And when you look at kind of the way 4A North shakes down, and even to some respects 4A South, I think 4A might be more open than it's been in a long time. I mean, I know Rochester has dealt with some injuries. You always have to know where they're at on the bracket. But I really kind of feel like we could end up with, usually I can make a list. I can make a real short list of combinations of teams that I think are going to be in the 4A state championship game. I think I can make a lot longer list this year and actually be able to kind of justify it in my mind of like, it could be these guys, it could be these guys. And you can kind of like move them around and be like, well, maybe it'll these guys. I mean, and it's something that I don't really think I've had a lot of discussion in my mind before. The short list in 4A is an actual short list in most years. I don't think it's an expansive list, but I think it has several more names than it usually has, at least in terms of legitimate threats to get to Hancock.
When we go to 3A for a second, as we continue the Byron discussion, is it too early to wonder how much fun a Byron-Wilmington semifinal might be?
Yeah, it might be a little too early because we just don't know exactly where they're going to fall.
Right.
Wilmington's so close right now between 2 and 3. There's an adjustment. Right now I got them in 3, but there's any number of 50 adjustments that could happen that could push them back into 2. That's how delicate this balance is when you're sitting right on the bubble. But I've witnessed a few amazing Byron-Wilmington games. I'll be honest, I'd love to see another one. I mean, wherever they have it. So it's definitely kind of a crazy situation to think about those two teams coming together. I mean, I've seen a game decided in the final minute between those two where Byron just ripped the win away from Wilmington that it looked like they had pretty much in the bag. I've seen it both ways. I mean, that's a rivalry that doesn't have a lot of games in it, but every one of those games has been pretty memorable that they have been contested.
This is the Friday Night Drive podcast, Week 8, the recap here on Shaw Local. Matt Rodewald, Steve Soucie with you. Let me take you the wide view, just because you're talking about how much fun you had with watching a Byron-Wilmington semifinal game or a postseason game just in November in either building is amazing. What's your favorite class when it comes down to seeing it in person, when you're going through the whole tournament, when you're going through the playoffs? Is there a class that you like that says, you know what, this feels so much fun? I mean, there's 8A semifinals where everyone's there, but I just think there's something about the mid-level ones to me. Is there one that jumps out off the page for you?
It's not necessarily one class, but I mean, might surprise you a little bit when I say this. I'm a 1A, 2A guy.
Yeah.
Like sometimes I love those games when it's a violent contrast. You got one team on one side that's 5 wide. You got a team on the other that's the double wing, and watching those two teams merge in the world of like, oh my gosh, what is this? I'm like, so I enjoy that contrast. I enjoy that contrast when you have those 1A, 2A teams where you've got 8 guys on each side of the ball that are playing practically every snap, and their uniforms look like they've gone through, an absolute mud swamp after it's over. It's just, there's something about that is always really intriguing to me. And like I said, I've seen some of my most memorable playoff games. If I were to make a list of the 10 or 15 most memorable playoff games I've ever seen, there would be an astonishing number of 1A and 2A games on that list if I really sat down and broke it down.
I just remember maybe it was a decade ago when Forreston had those really good teams, and they were practicing at night after the time change. Well, they don't have lights, or they had lights, but they didn't want to use them. So what do? We get the cars lined up. All the moms and dads get the cars lined up. They got to practice somehow. And they don't want to practice on the game field because it's just so muddy. They got to practice off the field. Well, there are no lights over there. And, just that kind of atmosphere and that kind of just like community bonding behind it is always something that is, I love to see that. My favorite probably has to be in that 6A range, 5A, 6A range. And, I grew up in a town like Geneva where there's now 20,000 people, but yeah, I like the smaller ones. I grew up on those 3A, 4As. But when you get a community that has the size but still has that small town feel, I'm looking at you, Sycamore. That's a perfect example where, like, when you're there in November, it's not just the building, it's not just the football field. You see the town, the marquee, you see the ribbons, every building, and you just feel like you walked into something that you won't understand really until maybe you leave. And even then, you may not fully comprehend it. I love the 3A and 4A in the same level. It's just not as big. You get to 7 and 8, and it's almost too suburban to get that full feel. One exception was being at that Barrington Maine South game last year.
Yeah.
And I've never heard Barrington as loud and have that sense of urgency, like of a team that just hasn't quite gotten there and knows this is their chance. But you and I both know Barrington's been on that quarterfinal line almost every year for like 15 years, and they finally broke through that. You could feel that. So I just kind of wanted to have that discussion of playoff atmosphere and that intensity about what it's like. And that's why it's fun to talk about the variety of what it's like and what's going to be like in Lena for a semifinal game. I want to switch to them, as we get back to the football for a second, because they've been flying under the radar and doing their thing. I saw the 22-10 final, and I kind of went, oh, I would imagine that they're the team up north that's going to get down there, but what have you noticed from what's going on with the Northwest Upstate Illini? It's not as deep as we've seen in years past.
But in some ways, I think it might actually be deeper. Like,
how so?
I mean, there are teams that like have not really performed that well over the last couple of years, and they kind of bounced back this year. I think the identities are different of the teams that we're expecting to be in the mix, because you come into the season, you're thinking to yourself, just based on past history, you have Forreston and Fulton, and those are the kinds of teams that you're thinking are going to be up in the mix, maybe at Lena level, but they're not there this year. They've fallen back a little bit, and Galena has taken their place. Eastland has taken their place, and they've put together some pretty good years, much better years than they've had, especially Galena over the last few years. So I think it's just kind of a different look for the conference. Lena's still the big dog, but the dogs that are trying to nip at their heels are different identities, and I think that's what's making it look a little bit different this year. Because, like I said, you're used to that Forreston game being the one. Yeah. And Forreston's not even a playoff team this year. So Obviously the landscape in that league has changed a little bit. It's still Lena, but I think maybe some of these other teams might be a little bit of an interesting attempt to be, to get knocked off. in that, I mean, Dupec goes up to 3A for the postseason, but I think that's an interesting team. We'll find out a lot more about them this week. They play undefeated Seneca. That's another one of those, an 8-0 that's got a really good football team on the other side this week. So, I've had some people tell me that they think Dupec's going to win that game comfortably. So, we'll find out. But it's one of those things where I think the second, third, fourth place teams I don't think history is going to change that. I think those teams are going to be capable in the playoffs as well. We're going to be hearing about them for a couple of rounds. And then I think Lena will do what Lena does. I mean, I think that they're going to make a deep run. Probably. I mean, it's silly to say, hey, I think they're a lock for Hancock, but I don't know who the combatant is that I would pick against them.
I think it's okay to say it'd be a surprise if they don't get to normal. That's okay. That's kind of their expectation. That's kind of ours too. So, but I tend to forget EPC. They've been solid for years. A couple trips down to Champaign, I believe, back in the day as well. And then Dupec, just because of the co-op aspect of it, they're in 3A, but they'd be a very, very good 1A football team too. So it's interesting to look at that. As we look at the conference depth, so to speak, is there a conference that we haven't talked about that might have a couple of 2-3 teams getting there? And I look at the Southwest Prairie, because I wonder what's going to happen not only with Oswego, but with some of those other teams there, just based on how the draw goes of a team like Minooka. How does Minooka fare here?
I don't know the answer to that right now. Oswego, I think, is a team, and we've talked about this before, has the components to kind of be a deep playoff team. Mm-hmm. I think there are consistency issues with just about everybody else in that conference. You don't know what version of that team is going to show up on a week-to-week basis, and that's a dangerous recipe in the playoffs. Like, you can't, I mean, especially if you get a difficult draw in that first round, if the bad version of you shows up for a quarter or two,
night,
it's going to be over with. I mean, those teams are gearing. Some of those teams, like Minooka, will be probably placed in the middle of the draw, somewhere in the 14 to 19 seed range, based on how it all breaks down. Probably going to end up getting a football team that is somewhat similar to them, but also very capable as well. So, and then the other ones, Plainfield North, Oswego East, if they get in, they're down at the bottom. So they're going to be drawing a top seed caliber type of team. And is it a public league school? Is it a powerhouse? I mean,
is it West Aurora?
You're throwing darts at the board. Yeah, that's another option. It's just like, what version of a top seed are you going to get here? Because there's a grab bag this year. It's not one of those situations where you're going, okay, I'm going to get one of the top 5 seeds. It's not a pick your poison type of situation. There are varying degrees of the quality of those teams at the top of the draw.
No 9-0 team is the same in the IHSA state playoffs. That's for sure. Depends on where they come from. That is something that we've learned to know. We've known to learn over the years. I wondered about downstate, because I wanted to get your thoughts on this as we wrap up here. East St. Louis, Edwardsville, a very good football game. What have you learned about how that game went? And we need to probably give some nod to Edwardsville as a team that's going to be dangerous in 7A, because everyone else in 7A says, no, you go. No, you take the lead. No, you be the favorite, because they don't want to be the favorite to win that class.
I think the most interesting piece of information that I picked up in regards to that game and how it played out was East St. Louis's starting quarterback was in uniform but did not play in that game. And having seen them live once and several other times on tape, I've been really impressed with him as a player in having an understanding of, hey, we don't always have to throw the 50-yard bomb. We can pick you to death by taking the 12-yard out and just nibbling and taking exactly what the defense is. I thought in every time I've seen him play, and I think that's probably 4 or 5 times, he's done a really, really good job of that, of just saying, hey, whatever the defense has given me, I'm going to detect it and I'm going to take it. And maybe I do get the opportunity to air it out and make the pretty ooh and ah 60-yard touchdown pass. But I don't know what the reason was that he did not play. I don't know if it was an injury or some sort of suspension of some sort.
You never know. Yeah.
So, but that I think was a pretty big contributing factor to why that game was that close. But I'd still like to give Edwardsville some flowers for that, because with or without him, I know that East St. Louis team is an absolute beast, especially on the defensive side of the ball. They're very difficult to deal with. So for them to keep that at a touchdown game, and to be honest with you, they were driving down the field and threw an interception under 2 minutes. They were inside the East St. Louis 30-yard line trying to go in for a potential game-tying score. So, or potential game-winning score based on how many people have gone for 2 in that situation this year. So they were right there, and that says a lot about them. The interesting thing about Edwardsville is they're hovering on that 7A, 8A line. Which class are they going to end up in? I think it's going to be 7, but there's a path to 8 as well. And I've seen Edwardsville make some runs in 7A where they seemingly have to make a 4-hour bus trip every day, and they seem to jump off the bus as fresh as a daisy, and before you know it, you're down 21-0. So, I mean, that's a program that probably doesn't get the respect that it deserves because it's kind of living in East St. Louis's shadow, but that's a good, strong program that if I'm somebody looking at whatever draw they end up in, I don't want to see Edwardsville pop up on the other side, whether it's to Edwardsville or Edwardsville coming to me. It is not something I want to see.
You really don't want to go down there.
Yeah.
You do not want, if you're up here, you do not want to go down there because, especially if it's a Friday, unlikely, but you have to deal with that Saturday 3:00 stuff sometimes with East St. Louis does that, only because of the bus ride. And it's a long day of football, and it affects you the next week. It impacts you. If you win that game, it will take a lot out of you towards the next week. So that's the tough thing. All right, you reminded me of something, and we'll end on this here because we're looking ahead to brackets a little bit, and I have all of these hypotheticals that I'll be throwing these at you quite a bit on Friday. So the thought is this: what's the team in 8A? If they win, it screws the whole thing up because they're the big school that pushes everyone down. Have you figured out who that team is yet? And in the reverse, is there a 1A team that if they win, that slides everyone up a class?
Well, I'll start with the 1A because that's the one that I think might actually happen. They're not necessarily 1A. I think they're 2, but it will still cause a
big mess
problem. Clifton Central at 4-4 is playing Salt Fork at 5-3. So Central, a typical playoff team. Mm-hmm. Salt Fork kind of had a hiccup last week. They lost to Oakwood, and that wasn't kind of expected to happen.
We saw that.
So maybe there's a window there for Clifton Central to pick off that win. If they do it, they go into the field, and it'll end up pushing everybody else down because the team that gets knocked out of there is a potential 4-5 team in that scenario. And all of the 4 and 5 teams that are lined up to get into this tournament are big schools. So it's going to cause a shift through multiple classes. And then you start talking about, well, who's on the bubble? And that's where the discussion gets fascinating because the team that's the biggest 4 right now, Rochelle. Ugh. The team that's the biggest 5 right now, Dunlap. The team that's the biggest 6, Willowbrook. So you start talking about teams that like you're used to seeing in other classes that I've just mentioned on the bubble on the low side of that. But that one game can move it in the way pushes them all the way down. So that's the situation that you're looking at. You're just looking at this from that perspective, and it gets a little bit crazy to just kind of break it down. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the thing that's kind of interesting about that is there are so few 4-4 teams that are in the 8A pocket right now. So in order that the ones that are largely projected to win, but you know how it gets. Sometimes somebody gets froggy, and a 4-4 team at this time of season, more so than any other time, I think is really vulnerable to just about anybody because that's the way this year has been. Like you can look at a 4-4 against a 3-5 or a 2-6, and that's a scary proposition. I mean, the one that is kind of weird that's sitting out there though is 3-5 Lockport and 4-4 Homewood Flossmoor. Homewood Flossmoor gets in with a win. Lockport, if they win it, they get to 4-5, and they get right smack in the middle of that glom of teams that has a lot of playoff points. But will it be enough? Is it enough? And the twisted thing about the way that this system works, by winning the game that they have to win, they're costing themselves a playoff point. So it's a playoff point that they really need at this time of the season. So they got to hope that if they win that game, that they get about 5 to 6 wins out of their schedule other than the team that they just beat. So what they need is they need their schedule, other than the Homewood game, who they just beat, they need their schedule to go 6-2 on Friday night to have a chance. 7-1 would be fabulous, but 5-3 probably isn't getting it done. So not only are you worried about getting your own outcome, you got to worry about the other 8 people that played on your schedule and whether or not they won too. And sometimes that's not even possible because your opponents are playing each other. Teams that you played are teams that you are both teams that you played on your schedule. They can't both win. So sometimes the 6-2 schedule of your opponents isn't even possible. So that's where it gets really, really layered when you start talking about, I need one more point. Like, it's just like, where am I going to get it from? And then you look at your schedule and it actually isn't even possible. That's one of those moments where it's just frustrating as all get out.
Leave you with that scenario because Lockport, if they get that win, they're looking at Plainfield North. Plainfield North is hosting Yorkville, who's 3-5, and Plainfield North is 4-4. So Wheaton North has Lake Park. That should be a win, but they went to overtime with Glenbard North. I have no idea.
And
that's
then the
crazy this time of year.
The crazier thing about that thing that you just mentioned about Plainfield North, if Plainfield North loses that game, then they go into that glob of teams with a lot of playoff points, a chance to get in that way. And the comedy of that is, if Plainfield North finishes 1 point ahead of Lockport, guess how they got that 1 point? Lockport beating Plainfield North.
Wow. And we're going to have hours upon hours to discuss this as we come to you for week number 9. For Steve Soucie, I'm Matt Rodewald. That's it for a week 8 recap. Thanks for joining us here at Friday Night Drive here on Shaw Local.